If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to Mindshock. This is Bruce McGuire. Today we have another interesting topic. The topic of well-read zombies. And I'm sure a lot of the listeners out there, particularly Mindshock listeners, those who are partial to the utilization of logic and reason, and not quite fond of scientism per se, other than the comedic value it can provide. So I'm sure the listeners out there have encountered many individuals who don't consider themselves zombies, part of the cognitive dissonant masses, the coincidence theorists hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult of state and authority worship and scientism. They consider themselves separate from the same cult they belong to just because they've read more propaganda studies. So they have just gone over more information, possibly memorized it, to just be able to regurgitate it on command. So they consider themselves a lot more informed than your average zombie. And because of that, they think that qualifies them to disassociate themselves from the rest of their cult, while pretending they're not in the cult of scientism. So I'll be examining that. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. If you like the podcast, hit the like button, share it across social media platforms, of which you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic requests. So if you're not a patron, jump on over to our Patreon page. Consider becoming a patron. Help us get more podcasts out quicker in a variety of topics, true crime cases, and logical analyses. To continue to promote the use of logic and reason and expose scientism masquerading as science, one of the biggest issues in modern society. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. All right, so I've actually done a lot of research on this, of course, in my continuing encounters on social media with these scientism worshippers, those hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult state authority scientism worship. And they just take as gospel whatever they see on the idiot box. Now, this group, I'm not going to fall for false dichotomies myself. That'd be logically fallacious. So there is a clear distinction between the non-well-read zombies, those who don't even look at any kind of reports or studies or the source material of anything. They just take as gospel whatever they see or hear on the idiot box by the corrupt profiteers. Now, there are even those that deny that scientism even exists. They're so triggered and heavily indoctrinated, they have to pretend that the religion of scientism isn't even a thing. That's how triggered they are. They're that silly that obviously their subconscious is triggered because their subconscious accurately identified their membership in this cult. So denying the cult's very existence, that's a convenient way of avoidance and denial. But there is a clear distinction, because a certain percentage of the brainless masses, the cognitive dissonant sheep, is well read. They read a lot more propaganda. They don't just read the headlines of the propaganda. They read the full reports, the full studies that don't adhere to the scientific method, but they pretend they do. They do a lot of reading. So this group are well-read zombies. And they think that justifies them to elevate their own position and opinions, again, whenever asking for any kind of proof adhering to the scientific method with actual verifiable and definitive controls, which is the very basis. Otherwise, how is it to be determined that what is being claimed is true and is because of one factor or variable and not another one? The burden of proof is always on the one making the positive claim. These are the basics of logic. But these well-read zombies, it's difficult to say. Their Dunning-Kruger's probably even more extreme because they've spent so much time with the propaganda. They have that much more invested that they're unable to critically analyze their own cognitive abilities and the validity of what they're regurgitating on command, like trained circus animals. Whether they went to an indoctrination facility and actually paid for a degree of indoctrination, or whether they just spent their time reading all this at home. And again, that doesn't mean the final conclusions are wrong. There's a lot of goofs out there that are so triggered they think that I'm saying that certain things are true or untrue. I'm not purporting anything to be true or untrue. I simply advocate for the scientific method and the use of logic and reason, which is going extinct in 2020 and the modern age. I mean, even the past decade or two, it's been a slide. And of course, now you have even National Geographic coming out and endorsing certain corrupt politicians over other corrupt politicians under the pretense that it'll save the planet in some capacity. I mean, the silliness is off the chart. But the indoctrinated, clueless masses is what made it possible. Because all these corrupt politicians, these corrupt profiteers, they would have no one to peddle this propaganda to. If there were logic and reason in the majority of populations, which there aren't. And again, a lot of that has to do with the good-hearted nature of the average human. It's very difficult unless you actually put in the time to study how these corrupt profiteers and psychopaths work. Because the average individual, again, my opinion, is that they're a good-hearted, good-natured human being. Therefore, it's very difficult for them to put themselves in the mental frame of a corrupt profiteer, and the fact that they would hoodwink. And then, of course, there's a fundamental lack of understanding by most coincidence theorists on how conspiracies are even carried out, because obviously you would have as few people in the know as possible. And then again, due to hubris and scientism, for whatever reason, the thoroughly indoctrinated have a really hard time with understanding that humans are fallible. I mean, it's not rocket science. Humans are fallible. They could be mistaken. And humans have egos. And as Upton Sinclair once said, it's very difficult to get a man to understand something which his paycheck depends on him not understanding. So whether you're talking climate change, vaccines, whatever, when there have been trillions of dollars invested in particular propaganda, regardless of whether the initiators of the propaganda really believed what they were saying, because maybe they did, but if they were mistaken, egos and these machines, the government, academic, big pharma, industrial complex, anything that threatens it, just like any system of authority or power, anything that threatens it must be quelled. And what's the easiest way to do that? You co-opt terms. You pretend scientism is science. I mean, that shuts things down real quick. They did a really good job with that propaganda. You pretend critical thinkers can just be written off as tinfoil conspiracy theorists. So when you have all this propaganda working together, it's actually pretty effective. I mean, whether you're a member of the scientism cult or not, you have to admit that it's pretty effective. True or untrue, I'm not even talking about whether it was true or not. I'm just talking about efficacy. And it's pretty effective. That's why so much money is dumped into it, because it's effective. And nobody even really cares about the truth. I saw an interesting study that the KGB did, which it's getting a little bit of airtime on social media now with people sharing information about it. But when you inundate a population for, I think they said it was 2 months of fear-based propaganda, regardless of whether it's true or not, in the study it was false. After about 2 months, they are so brainwashed, they have lost all ability to discern. So no matter how much fact-based information, empirically verifiable, definitive truths you show them, at that point, their brains are no longer capable of towing anything other than that fear-based propaganda lie they were indoctrinated with and inundated with for that 2-month period. Is that what we're seeing on the news cycles for this so-called pandemic? Is that what we're seeing? And is that why so many people are just flipping out over masks and all these things? And you never see anybody discussing the scientific method with controls. It's like nobody even knows what a control is, and they pretend this is scientific, and common sense and real science is anti-science. And when you have all these people pretending, it's difficult to get any kind of kernels or truth or legitimate lines of inquiry in. But of course, that's where studying basic psychology comes in, because identifying what makes people triggered and why, because they've recognized of either the truth or the extreme validity of the line of inquiry. It's like, wait a second, if masks don't work, why are we wearing masks? And if they really do work, why has the information not been presented? So, with controls, of course. And then, obviously, regarding the pandemic, it all goes back to Pasteur's germ theory, Béchamp's cellular theory. If you haven't checked out the Mindshock podcasts on that, check it out. We go over coronavirus quite a bit with logic and reason at the forefront, not scientism, not logical fallacies, because scientism only has faith and fallacies within its propaganda to back it up. Once those are all exposed, there's really nothing left. So these well-read zombies out there, for whatever reason, they think that just because they've read more propaganda and in more detail, that their scientism is somehow not scientism. It's quite amusing in its own way. But it's definitely a group of people, and of course the truly well-educated, so-called educated, or the highest levels of indoctrination, the PhDs, the people who, on both sides, the people that are actually scientific, they can identify BS, and then the people who are just hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult of scientism who also have PhDs. Both of those groups don't typically go on social media. So the people that you have on social, there's exceptions, of course, and I've talked to some of them, but most of them don't. So these well-read zombies are not the cream of the crop. But because instead of, they watch X amount less hours of Netflix, or, they spent less time at the bar than other Joe Schmoes, they consider themselves not part of that scientism delusion cult. And it's interesting because they're able to regurgitate more information, but they're still not able to actually prove how any of it adheres to the scientific method with controls. And that's what's amusing. So these well-read zombies are definitely distinct from the not well-read zombies, because obviously zombies can read. Comprehension is a completely separate issue. And then also individuals, when triggered, obviously, comprehension falls by the wayside once an individual is triggered and their faith-based beliefs are exposed as faith-based. But the easiest way to identify these people, they talk very similar to the non-well-read zombies. They make these circular reasoning, logical fallacies, these faith-based presuppositions as claims, and they just stack them on top of each other. Obviously, if you guys have not checked out the Scientism Simplified podcast, I go over easy ways in which to identify scientism, how people hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult of scientism argue or present information, and also where they are unable to discern real science from scientism. But it's really quite simple. If you can prove adherence to the scientific method with controls, definitive, verifiable controls, so you can prove that this factor caused this and not a different factor. But if you're just piling on House of Cards assumptions and then deferring to faith and fallacies like appeal to popularity, peer review, all false theories that passed peer review were peer reviewed. At a certain point when the propaganda money runs out or the corruption is exposed, then how much, in hindsight, you can see how much that peer review is worth. And that's why appeal to authority, appeal to popularity. That's why these are logical fallacies, because they have no validity when it comes to truth, because the truth is whatever it is, regardless of how many people are fallible or mistaken or corrupt and paid off, or a combination of the two. And for whatever reason, coincidence theorists and those hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult of state authority worship and scientism, they just have a really hard time with that. But well-read zombies, of course, are their own unique breed. And their Dunning-Kruger is even more severe, because they think that going over more information somehow gives their opinion more validity. If you read a million books on a false theory or a million different studies, if you really spend the time and go over that tobacco science or that sugar science, it's not going to make it any more true. It's not going to magically make verifiable and definitive controls manifest out of the ether just because someone spent time on it. You could read false theories all day long, all year long, your whole entire life, which is actually what most people do without even realizing. But, which, I mean, again, this is just humans and the lessons of hubris, of course. Plenty to be learned from that. If you haven't checked out the podcast, Hubris and Maturity, I go over that as well. So these are very, very interesting factors in how the average human exists in modern society, inundated by corrupt profiteers spreading their propaganda on the idiot box. And identifying how it all works and how people respond is all quite interesting, especially if people are really concerned with the truth and why so many people fall for this propaganda and why logic and reason has been indoctrinated out of a population, because it's the easiest way to keep everyone compliant and under control. I've actually been asked multiple times to make up a reading list, but and I will do that. I guess I'll release a podcast where I go over an essential reading list for not to fall for coincidence theory or scientism. I'll probably have Sid Irwin on for that one. He's quite astute, and I'm sure he's read a diverse catalog of philosophers and analysts on a variety of topics. But one of the top books would have to be Sun Tzu's Art of War, because some of these tactics, controlled opposition through false dichotomies and all these things, these are old tactics that have been around for a very, very long time. The reason why? Because they work. And they work very, very well, as we can see just by observing these zombies walking around, well read or not. Hope you guys enjoyed another edition of the Mindshock podcast. If you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. If you want to send along a request with a PayPal, you could do that also if you don't want to go through the trouble of becoming a patron. But if you do become a patron, you could help support the channel and get more podcasts out, more true crime cases covered. We have a bunch more wrongful exonerations to go over. And you can request topics based on your tier to be a guest on the podcast. And you could also get any and all questions answered in priority fashion. You could also check us out Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit. If you like this particular podcast, hit that like button, share it across social media platforms. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.